When talking about charity entrepreneurship, one of the first questions that comes to a lot of people's minds is, when is charity entrepreneurship a particularly good fit? When should one consider for-profit entrepreneurship? How does social entrepreneurship fit into this? Charity entrepreneurship itself is probably the smallest of these groups, the least known. By default, people will be considering for-profit entrepreneurship or social entrepreneurship. So we wanted to spend a bit of time talking about how we see this, how we kind of split them out, what the distinctions are, where we think certain avenues are more promising, where we think certain avenues are less promising, kind of within these different areas. This will be a pretty quick overview. We're covering a bunch of content, but we are also writing up something a bit more detailed for our blog. So if you follow our blog or our newsletter, you'll see it pop up there too, as we kind of write something more extensive. So let's start off with our specialty area, the area that we have the most confidence in, the area that we work in full time, thinking about kind of nonprofit and charity entrepreneurship. Generally, we're very confident because we have done this before, many people on our team, and we've seen a lot of very high impact charities get started this way. There's a lot of expert interviews and models and kind of evidence that we have. So this is the area that we feel most confident kind of speaking about what's promising or what's not promising. Now, an interesting distinction that we'll talk about for all these options, but I think is particularly interesting when it comes to nonprofit entrepreneurship, is the difference between an average nonprofit and a top nonprofit. Now, unfortunately, the nonprofit world is a bit of a zero-sum game. Basically meaning if you start a charity, typically you're fundraising from other charities, money that would kind of otherwise go to charitable activities, which means that if you start an organization, and in fact it's a bad organization, this could be net negative for the world. Maybe your work is helping people, but if it's not helping as much as the kind of charity that would have been supported by your donations, that can make it a net negative endeavor. So a tricky part about nonprofit entrepreneurship is the average org might not have that much impact at all. If they are average kind of compared to all the other charities in their sector, you're kind of just moving money around from one area to the other. This doesn't say, though, what the top organizations have in terms of impact. And of course, as charity entrepreneurship and hopefully as charity founders in general, that's what we want to do. We want to start a really fantastic charitable organization. We don't want to start kind of an average or mediocre charitable organization. And this is where we think charity entrepreneurship can be very hard to beat. It looks like a really, really promising avenue if you can start one of these top charitable organizations. When we're talking about top, we're talking about evidence-based, cost-effectiveness, evaluated by external reviewers like GiveWell, this sort of thing. If you start, say, the top-ranked charity by GiveWell, that's a really fantastically impactful career path. So interesting distinction here when thinking about nonprofit entrepreneurship is you really do want to think, how does your nonprofit compete with other nonprofits in the similar space, especially other nonprofits that are being funded by the people who'd be funding your organization. There's kind of a cost to that. So overall, we do think nonprofit entrepreneurship is kind of a really exciting career path. We think it's something that should be on a lot more people's radars. However, we don't think it's the best fit for everyone. And we do think it's a fairly small number of nonprofits that can have this kind of potential to be extremely high impact. And those are the ones that we try to work with and provide resources for and that sort of thing. That's part of why we don't have a really huge cohort. We don't have a cohort of, say, like 500 people who want to start charities and kind of help those charities get started, because the average org doesn't provide the same level of impact as kind of these top focusing on a few really, really specific charities that end up having a big impact. So moving on to social entrepreneurship, I've actually broken social entrepreneurship into kind of two different subcategories of social entrepreneurship, because it's a really big field and there's kind of 100 different ways to do about it. But I think these two categories are pretty relevant. So one category is what I've called flow-through effects social entrepreneurship. This is basically starting an organization where you are making a profit. That's kind of the model it's structured as. It probably be registered as a for-profit company. But there are some secondary effects of the entrepreneurship, which is quite significant. This sort of organization might be something that, generally works in the revenue thing, but has a lot of benefits. Wave is an example of this that many of you may know about, where they help financial transactions happen in lower income countries. And it's not like they're fundraising a whole bunch of donations or kind of running a split revenue model. They are a for-profit company. But they are doing something that makes the world a much better place by existing in kind of the for-profit space. So This is a pretty exciting sort of opportunity if there are kind of low-hanging fruits here for things that can be run in basically a for-profit way, but can also have these kind of positive flow-through effects. They don't all have to be organizations that work in lower income countries, although I think that's probably a particular niche where this sort of thing comes up a lot. It could also be something that has a flow through effect on mental health. I often use like meetup.com as a good example of this. I think it's quite a good thing for more people to have like social platforms to meet up with each other. And that seems to have like some quite positive externalities on top of the revenue generated that of course you could donate to a charity. Tricky part about this is I think it's very, very challenging. Maybe even more challenging than charity entrepreneurship or for-profit entrepreneurship, because you are kind of narrowed in your scope of ideas, and you do have to compete in a pretty for-profit sort of world. You're looking for investors generally who aren't funding this because of social impact or this sort of thing. So you have to compete on the for-profit merits, but then of course also keeping an eye on these kind of flow-through effects. Average org, I think there's some benefits, but of course a lot of the benefits are going to come in when you get very large. So that can be the trick. We're less confident in this area. It's not something that we've incubated a whole bunch of charities on or a whole bunch of organizations on. And for top founders, we do think it can be quite a competitive option, especially if you view a significant part of your impact as donating the revenue. So if you can get your organization to do a pledge, or you can personally make a lot of finances and then make a pledge to donate it yourself. Next option we have here is double bottom line social entrepreneurship. So this is a bit what I alluded to when breaking out the categories. This revenue model is different than a for-profit revenue model. It is generally seeking donations and kind of aiming to balance off some of these nonprofit benefits with some of the for-profit benefits. I think this is really, really tough to do right. There is the occasional organization that looks pretty good here. Living Goods is a Give Well Standout charity, is probably the best example I know of kind of having this double revenue model where they're kind of selling medical supplies, but at a discount that's kind of subsidized by charitable donations. But it's really, really tough because if you're looking for kind of charitable funding, often there are more effective organizations that are going to do a lot with that charitable funding, kind of to get it done. And if you're looking at the for-profit funding, it's very hard to compete in that way as well. You're just kind of juggling two different metrics. It's very hard to maximize two things at once. So again, we're not super confident in this area. It's not an area we've done a ton of research into, but we're a lot less optimistic about this area when it comes to social entrepreneurship, as opposed to one that can be run in more of a linear for-profit way, and then kind of be the flow-through effects can kind of cause some benefits. So last one we'll talk about, of course, is the most known one, which is for-profit entrepreneurship. We have medium confidence in this. There's been quite a bit of research done by the effective altruism movement, and there's quite a lot of data about how much successful entrepreneurs donate and this sort of thing. It can be a significant benefit. And one thing that's nice about for-profit entrepreneurship is that the average for-profit entrepreneurship can still be quite an impactful career path. Even if you're not, say, one of the very best for-profit founders, which I think is super hard to do because, of course, it's a very competitive field. The average kind of organization can start, it can scale up a little bit, it can earn some revenue and donate some of that revenue to, say, top effective charities. So this actually has the kind of highest scoring average org of the different orgs that we're looking at, where there's not really a potential for it being net negative. I mean, of course, there are some for-profits which are net negative, but I guess assuming that it's in a fairly neutral space, like a digital app or something like this, mainly it's going to be the donations that are going to kind of dictate how impactful this is. And that can nice linearly scale. And obviously, with most entrepreneurship, including for-profit entrepreneurship, it's quite power lawed. So a lot of the donations will come from people who make it really big, but even some medium level of success can lead to being quite a significant donor to a charity and supporting a charitable organization a lot. So overall, we think this is a pretty strong option. This is an option we actually do recommend to a lot of people who are considering charity entrepreneurship, but also interested in general entrepreneurship and want to have an impactful way. You can be involved in the charity sector by being a for-profit entrepreneur and then donating and kind of becoming a trustee or becoming involved in an organization from a donor or mentorship perspective. We've also had a lot of benefits in talking to successful for-profit entrepreneurs and pulling those lessons into the charity field. It has much better feedback loops. So often for-profit entrepreneurs can learn in a different way that's hard to achieve in the nonprofit sector. The One thing I'll mention in the for-profit sector that's kind of worth flagging is the idea of value drift. So this is the idea that maybe you'll go in starting for-profit and you'll really want to donate a huge percentage of your profits or something like this. But if you get kind of caught up with other entrepreneurs who maybe aren't as charitably involved, it's easy for that to kind of get lost in the shuffle of things. Especially as an entrepreneur, you're thinking about a million different things, and it's easy to kind of drift away from maybe the original purpose if you're kind of looking to have an impact by doing an entrepreneurship project. So really worth highlighting here that it's really important if you're doing for-profit entrepreneurship or really any sort of entrepreneurship, particularly with for-profit entrepreneurship, you want to maintain a community of other charitable and altruistic people that will really help for kind of staying involved long-term in the charity community. It's easy to value drift otherwise, to kind of drift away from the purpose. So that was a lot of information rather quickly, so sorry about that. But next up, let's dive into career paths a little bit. So these are career paths that are kind of around charity entrepreneurship. You know, if someone's excited about charity entrepreneurship, they might want to consider kind of close by adjacent jobs. So one of these, and perhaps the most obvious one, is getting a job at a nonprofit, getting a job at an early stage nonprofit. And we get a lot of questions about this, like, okay, you say that working at an early stage nonprofit is great, but how can you kind of get into this early stage nonprofit? You know, fairly limited roles, they're fairly competitive, this sort of thing. A few different recommendations we have here is getting really, really knowledgeable in the subject that you want to specialize in. So I say getting a PhD in quotes, not literally going and getting a PhD, more like becoming a deep expert. So read 5 books on the topic, read a dozen blog posts on the topic, read a bunch of content, and kind of get to the point where you could converse with experts who have been studying it at quite a high level. This doesn't have to take 4 years like a PhD program would. Often you can do this with 6 months of really intensive study. You can get to a level where you're able to have these kind of high level conversations if you're kind of dedicating yourself to researching. So that's a really great way to kind of level up and skill up in that topic area, especially if you have a specific cause area or a specific charity idea that you're most excited about. The other thing that early stage charities look for is demonstration of high quality work. So if you can have an independent research project that's really impressive to show off, or some volunteering experience or portfolio of work, this can be a really good way to kind of show off that, hey, I am going to be a really good fit for this organization. I am able to do work at a really high quality level. All of these things are also great practice for charity entrepreneurship. So if you're thinking about charity entrepreneurship as a potential career path, as a path that you're considering in the long term, all of these things, especially the independent projects, is a really good way to kind of build up your expertise. I want to talk about some key talent gaps in cause areas, and this can also relate to jobs when you're thinking about what's impactful in charity entrepreneurship and what might be a good fit for people who are kind of considering charity entrepreneurship but have a specific cause area that they're interested in. So starting with kind of global health, there's a few different kind of bottlenecks, things that limit the field, things that make it hard for a lot of new charities to get started in it. One is funding. So getting good at fundraising or getting funding, that's going to be a really crucial skill if you end up starting a charity in the field. Similarly, working for foundations, helping affect their principles so that they're more effective or more effectiveness oriented. That can be a really great way to prepare your skills for kind of what foundations are looking for when they're considering new projects, and also just building up the ecosystem of young, effective projects and there being support for them. And the other thing is measurement and evaluation. So probably the limiting factor for almost any organization is really doing a good job at getting a sense of its impact and knowing that it actually is having, say, a higher impact than where the money or where the time would have gone otherwise. So I often tell people it's hard to get too much experience in measurement and evaluation, and I do think that kind of continues to be true. So if you are looking at charity entrepreneurship as a career path or as an interest area, getting a role or getting a job in a measurement and evaluation organization or as a measurement and evaluation specialist for an organization that's kind of focused on that can be a fantastic way to start to build up this kind of analytical mindset that eventually you might want to apply to your own charitable organization. Moving on to mental health, another area we've kind of looked at and researched. It has different challenges. Funding is also up there. There's not as much funding in mental health as probably there should be. It's kind of a new issue. Foundations are moving towards it, but a bit slowly. But the other big gap here with mental health is research. So if you're kind of looking at a space like mental health where there's a little bit less research available, the studies are mostly done, in higher income countries, mostly not done with an eye towards charitable interventions or cost-effective interventions, that can be a really key area to kind of improve on. So if you're looking at starting a charity in mental health, getting some experience researching, volunteering with a research organization or doing an independent research project on the field, that can be a really good way to kind of get a foot in the door and kind of entering this cause area and building up some expertise that will be kind of particularly useful. Next up in the animal space, so a bit different. A lot of the difficulties in the animal space are actually to do with management and leadership. So the animal movement is quite young. Demographically, it's a lot of people who don't have a lot of experience with management and leadership and kind of these standard organizational norms. So if you're looking at the animal space and thinking, hey, eventually I want to start a charity here, or eventually I want to work in this space, building up those sorts of expertises will go you the furthest, even if it's not kind of in an animal NGO specifically. I'd be looking for an organization that teaches generally good management and good leadership practices that you can then kind of transfer over. So it could be particularly a well-regarded charity in a given field, or it could be a for-profit. Both of those, I think, are quite useful. The other thing that people are really desperately looking for in animals is experience in Asia. So the animal movement has developed a lot in North America, and that's been great. And it's been growing in Europe and it had some major successes in Europe. But the rest of the world is not as developed communities. So definitely, if you can or are from a certain region that is kind of neglected, there's lots of interest, I think, in animal orgs kind of working in expanding to these more neglected regions, but they find it difficult to find people with experience. And obviously ideal if you're born and have you can have a lifetime of experience in the country, but also living in a different country can start to build up this experience too. If you work in a given region for a couple of years with one charity, that's going to be able to transfer some of that knowledge to the next charity that you end up working for. And the last one is the EA meta space. So the effective altruism community does a lot of good things and values things quite differently. It's generally not a community that is struggling from a funding perspective, but what they do look for is people that make really, really good decisions. It's a big part of what we talk about in CE, and a big part of what we put out as our research kind of our freely available content is on decision making. And they also look for people who can kind of tie communities together. So this could be running events, this could be discussing things in large groups of people. This, again, could kind of tie back a little bit to management. These sort of skills are definitely at the top of the list when people are thinking about working in EA meta charities, getting involved, especially in early stage meta charities, and this sort of thing. Some cross-applicable skills that are kind of talent gaps across all of these. The younger an organization you're working for, the more different hats you're going to wear. So kind of naturally, if you are looking for charity entrepreneurship as a career path, or entrepreneurship in general, or early stage NGOs, kind of having the expectation and having some of these generalized abilities where, yeah, one day I'm going to be talking in front of a crowd, then the next day I'm going to be looking up how to register in a country, that sort of thing becomes more and more there. So the more generalist ability you can get as well, the more helpful it is when considering these kind of adjacent to charity entrepreneurship type paths. A note on these, I would also want to say there's lots of great charities out there. Obviously, we focus on charity entrepreneurship and kind of starting new organizations, but there are lots of really strong charities where marginal hire can make quite a difference. Some of the young charities that we know, they'll have a hiring round and they will hire their best hire, and sometimes they might hire nobody. That can make a really big difference if you're the difference between no one getting hired and getting hired, and it can give you a lot of useful experience in the field. The last thing I wanted to talk about was kind of pathways to get involved. So we run charity entrepreneurship as a program, but it's not a good fit for everyone. It's a fairly small number of people that we can take in, and some people are unable to dedicate months or all these sort of different things. So one of the things we're really focusing on this year is how can we build a larger community around charity entrepreneurship. And one of the things is events like this, more public events where we can kind of share some information and this sort of thing with a wider audience than just the people who end up going through the program. But there's a few different ways to kind of get involved that I think are quite valuable to mention here, and definitely should be on your radar if you're excited about charity entrepreneurship, or just excited about making a difference in the world. It doesn't have to be charity entrepreneurship specific. So one thing is volunteering. There are effective altruism chapters all over the world. Definitely a good thing to look out for and get involved in. Your city might already have a chapter, or university might already have a chapter. That's a thing to look for. And if you're already involved in a chapter, a way to kind of take it to a higher level is we've started a new program, which we've kind of called Adopting an Effective Nonprofit. It's kind of where a chapter partners quite closely with a new organization, an organization often with just a couple staff who have just been founded through the Charity Entrepreneurship Program. And they kind of provide some of the mentorship, some of the volunteer hours, some of the support that charity needs. And I think it can be really good because it can kind of give your chapter a sense of purpose to rally around, an organization that can kind of feel like their organization to help support. And it can be a bit more motivating than kind of just helping a big monolithic organization like Charity Entrepreneurship or something like this. So that's definitely a thing that is worth having on people's radars. The other thing is that we are trying to build a charity entrepreneurship volunteer network. And this is built to help people gain experience in skills that are kind of relevant to charity entrepreneurship and to adjacent jobs to charity entrepreneurship, so for-profit entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship and this sort of thing. And we're trying to make a volunteer network that's quite low time commitment. So typically volunteering opportunities, especially at early stage charities, they want you to invest a lot of hours, 10 hours a week or something like this. We're trying to make this a little bit more light touch, a little bit more comfortable so that people can kind of do this in a part-time capacity when they're working a full-time job or that sort of thing and still have an impact. The other way that is very much worth considering is mentoring of charities. So basically, you might be able to volunteer and help with your hours, but another way that a lot of people can help is if they have a specific skill set or specific knowledge. And a few people even ask questions about this. What if I have a certain ability that I think is quite useful? This is another thing that we're going to be building up this year, kind of a charity entrepreneurship and mentorship network, really aiming to kind of share knowledge and expertise with kind of quite young organizations that really can benefit from this. When you're a young organization, you're not going to have an expert in most topics. You're going to have a couple generalized staff, and you're going to rely quite heavily on advisors and mentors and experts. So this is another thing that I really strongly encourage people to get involved with if they're interested in the entrepreneurship space, signing up to be a mentor, and then the charities, when they have a particular question or a particular need, they'll be able to be connected with you, and you'll be able to share kind of your expertise about these topics. And this can make a huge difference. I've definitely seen mentors, help a charity avoid a mistake that would take them 6 months to correct, or mentors who have contributed quite significantly to the strategic direction of a charity. One other thing I'll mention here with the mentorship is typically mentors imagine that they have to have a very specific piece of knowledge. I have to be an expert in fundraising or an expert in charitable law or something like this. But there is a place for generalized mentors too. Some of the people who are on the charity entrepreneurship kind of informal advisory board are just very sharp individuals who can help give a second set of eyes on something, can look through some calculations, can provide some kind of guidance from that higher level. So even if there's not a specific skill that jumps out to you as obvious from a mentorship perspective, I would still encourage you to kind of set up the network, and we'll see if there kind of is a way for you to contribute in that kind of knowledge building expertise way. I think there is more often than people expect knowledge that they can contribute even from seemingly unrelated fields. The other way to get involved is learning. So of course, we've tried to put up a lot of content online. So whether that's putting up our online course or our reading list or all these other sorts of things, our past blog content. We have a whole bunch of free resources that are available on our website and that sort of thing. So do check them out. We do try to put up stuff that's kind of broadly relevant. It is more focused on charity entrepreneurship and that career path, but a lot of it does apply to early stage entrepreneurship in general. I think our most recent blog post was about hiring for an early stage organization. A lot of that is going to be cross applicable to people who are in a small organization in kind of any capacity, even if they're not the co-founders of it. In general, for our events, as Antonia mentioned, our newsletter is probably the best source. So that is where you can kind of see our events come up and have a sense of all the things that are going on, but also Facebook and that sort of thing. We're probably going to try to have a few more events like this over the course of the year. So we didn't do a ton of these last year, but we will do a few more this year, and we'll have panels of speakers and this sort of thing who are kind of talking about key concepts in charity entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship related spaces. So that's it. That's all I have to say on that. And I want to leave lots of time for questions. I think I went a bit over the time planned anyways. But yeah, I know a lot of information to take in. We will try to put in a lot of this information on our website, on our blog, in kind of more detailed articles and that sort of thing. But yeah, excited to get to the questions and talk about kind of anything related to this.
I'll jump in with the questions, and you can continue sending your questions to Patrick as we go along. What is it like to volunteer for CE? And related to that, what opportunities are there for volunteering in other small stage charities?
Yeah. So maybe I'll answer the second part of that question first, which is volunteering opportunities at other small scale charities. One thing that's tricky is a lot of charities don't have the capacity to manage volunteers. So often they won't advertise roles and that sort of thing. But that doesn't mean you can't get involved or kind of demonstrate that you are really keen on the charitable organization. So sometimes you might have to kind of contact an organization and say, hey, I'm really passionate about your work. Here's something I'd love to do. Do you have the capacity? But for kind of more formalized volunteer programs like the CE volunteer program, we have kind of two different pathways. One, we have kind of a more formal, like volunteer internship, where people are kind of putting in pretty consistent hours. They're being managed. The volunteer network that we're organizing now is going to be run quite differently. It's going to be people meeting as a group, so with one CE staff and maybe 7 or 8 volunteers, and then kind of working through different problems and maybe focusing in a certain area or a certain region. Hey, here's some problems that our charity have encountered. How could we solve this with kind of the capacities and expertise that we have? So that'll be kind of a new way going forward. I think historically our volunteers have been pretty excited about the opportunity to get involved and pretty happy with the volunteering experience at CE. The complaint we've heard is we haven't had a lot of capacity. So generally we've only been taking on, 3 or 4 volunteers a year or something like that, not a huge number. And that's been unfortunate because there's a lot more people who are kind of excited to volunteer. So I think that's what we've been focusing on. How do we kind of broaden the network so that more people can get involved on a voluntary basis and kind of contribute and meaningfully contribute, and also give some more flexibility around people who don't have a ton of hours to put in reliably.
Great, yeah. And one more question about volunteering. Does your organization, does Charity Entrepreneurship work with or support other nonprofit organizations with similar objectives? So sort of thinking about whether there are sort of training, mentorship, or affiliation opportunities for other early stage nonprofits.
Yeah, so our program is a bit unique. We try to put out some of the content online and this sort of thing. In terms of training for early stage nonprofits, yeah, it's tough. I would say there's not a lot of resources that are kind of in the more measurement and evaluation vein that I'd be excited about. There's some courses that are offered. For instance, there's a development economics micromasters that's offered by MIT. That's kind of in the same vein. But it's pretty different. I think what we offer is a bit unique relative to what other people are kind of focusing on in the charitable space. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I'm also getting a couple of questions about sort of developing countries. So how can entrepreneurs from developing countries get involved with CE, and sort of like, are there any particular approaches that we take to institutional issues in those countries?
Yeah, so to answer the first question, yeah, I mean, the program itself is international. The volunteering network is international. We generally we'll have a volunteer group of 8 people, and there'll be people from 6 different countries or something like that. And that's both higher income and middle income and low income countries. All of that is there. So I think similar pathways in that sort of context. In terms of institutional stuff, we are looking more at policy issues. So we do have a couple kind of health policy recommendations that are to do with taxation. And we are, one of our main focuses for this year is researching other policy avenues, policy generally in low and middle income countries. So we might come to some more avenues. Obviously, it's a really complex field, so it takes a long time to kind of come to really good recommendations for those areas. To think about the flow-through effects and where that government's going to move its resources from and all these sorts of things. But yeah, it's definitely an area we're interested in exploring more, the kind of policy sphere of things. And I'm sure there are some very high impact opportunities in there. It's just a matter of kind of figuring them out.
Great, yeah, thank you. And so how do you decide in which country you should start a new charity?
Yeah, this is a really great question because I think that most people do this in a very different way than how we do. So uh, your natural tendency is to start a charity in the country that you're kind of born into or you're most familiar with or this sort of thing. You know, it's just what's most salient. But I actually think that most of the time, issues can have very different levels of importance or magnitude in different countries. So, if you do research, so say one of the areas we researched was alcohol taxation this year or last year, we found that to be a very promising area. It's not necessarily going to be the most promising in the UK or in Canada, where I'm from. What we want to do is kind of look across the whole globe, make a spreadsheet about all the different factors that would go into kind of starting a good charity in this space. So, you know, government openness, current taxation rate, all the different kind of factors. We often have a big spreadsheet with like 30 or 40 different factors, as well as 30 or 40 different countries that are considered. And we kind of fill that out, figure out what countries look particularly anomalous in terms of a good fit for this sort of charitable organization. So we don't have a particular preference towards any country going into it. We really do just try to find the best interventions and then try to kind of do the research across many different countries and see where there's a particular fit. If there's a co-founder who has particular knowledge or expertise, that might move a country slightly higher up the list. So maybe, you know, we have the top 3 countries for alcohol taxation and we have a co-founder who's particularly knowledgeable in the third of those countries. That could still be a very good fit. But if, say, someone's interested in an issue, but they're knowledgeable in the 200th country or the 100th top rated country, then generally we think about, okay, well, how can you build expertise? How can you work with local nonprofits or make a hire in that country to kind of be able to do the work where it's most impactful? So comparison, analysis, research, very similar to how we come to the interventions. That's generally how we're kind of selecting priority countries for those interventions.
Great, thank you. And sorry, just to clarify, I think some people are sort of sending questions to me directly, and just a quick reminder that it's actually best to direct your questions to Patrick, who is paying attention to the chat. So direct message to Patrick Stadler. Thank you. Yeah, and then another question that has been coming up. So is there a possibility of establishing a chapter of CE in a different country or location? It seems like this question of sort of charity entrepreneurship opportunities in other countries and in other languages. We also got a question about Francophone people. So yeah, could you talk a bit, Joey, about chapters, the possibility of chapters of CE in other countries and how non-English speaking communities can potentially get involved?
Yeah, this is something we're very, very excited about to do in the future. You know, historically, we have either run the program in London or online. But of course, we're primarily hitting people in the English-speaking world, and that's a pretty small percentage of the total world. And we have noticed that if we are talking to people from different countries, there is definitely more excitement about a CE-style program running in a country or close by country. It could be a continent or a region in some cases. So it is something we're considering. We thought quite a lot about doing kind of picking a certain region and doing some region-targeted research this year. We didn't end up doing it this year, but we are thinking about maybe doing it next year. And part of our program this year is we're actually accepting applicants who want to do some region-focused research themselves and potentially come up with key ideas. Now, if we found a few key ideas, maybe 3 in a target region, that would be pretty strong incentive to run a charity entrepreneurship program there. So whether that would be a full chapter or whether we would just kind of run the program there, over the summer, or over the winter, or something like this, that's kind of an open question. But definitely, we want to get our program more internationally, and we are going to be looking into translation of different languages. French probably isn't at the top of the list. Probably Spanish or Arabic would be higher, but definitely something we want to look into. You know, obviously, we think this content is like kind of unique and kind of interesting, and it would be nice if it was able to be accessed by more people.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move on to quite a few questions that we got about comparing charity entrepreneurship to sort of other options. So could you talk about at what point in someone's career it might make most sense to go into an effective altruism role, do you think that it's better to sort of dive into an EA role right out of university, or do you think it's better to spend some time building up career capital, say through industry experience, for example?
Yeah, the boring answer is, of course, it depends. I would say don't let being young or being an early graduate stop you from applying for these positions and this sort of thing. But it's worth keeping in mind that they are quite competitive. So it is very possible that kind of you come out of early stage and you go, I'm really excited about working for an EA org or working at an early stage charity or starting my own charity. And you do hear that, okay, you need to go get some experience in this field or that field or that sort of thing. So yeah, apply, but have backup options. You know, there's a college kind of description, which people often say, apply for 3 colleges you think you have no chance of getting into, apply for 3 that are about where you think you'll get, and apply for 3 as a backup, you know, ones that you think for sure you'll get into. I think that sort of thing can apply for career opportunities as well. So we have let in very young people to our program, people who are straight out of school, but often these are, you know, highly talented young people. So you know, they do have some skills that they're bringing to the table that are making up for this experience difference. So yeah, apply, but have backup options ready, and keep in mind that if charity entrepreneurship isn't a fit this year, you know, it might be a fit 2 years from now or a year from now. We often get applications from people who have, you know, applied, didn't get in, kind of skilled up, and then we're able to apply again and kind of move further in the process or get into the program eventually. That definitely does happen. So that sort of thing. That being said, I do want to be cautious about giving the advice. I think too often, especially for competitive roles, the advice given to everyone is kind of, oh, go build up a bunch of expertise and then you'll come back and you'll kind of get in for sure. Sometimes it might just not be a good fit. So with charity entrepreneurship, it is a pretty small number of people. You know, it might only be 1% of the population that's a really good fit for it. So if you have applied for a couple of programs or tried to skill up and there's still some sort of block, thinking about other career options, you know, maybe for-profit entrepreneurship is a good way to pivot or something like that.
Yeah, and sort of on the topic of for-profit entrepreneurship, when do you think that for-profit entrepreneurship might be a better fit for someone? Do you think that there are certain skill sets that are more conducive to pursuing the for-profit entrepreneurship path?
Yeah, so one of the biggest differences I see with nonprofit versus for-profit is nonprofit has a lot more measurement and evaluation aspects to it. There's not as clear a feedback loop that you are doing good. You have to kind of be really careful about that and really analyze it yourself. There's a little bit less benefits of being, say, extremely confident in a nonprofit setting, because you don't want to think that you're helping lots of people, but not actually be. In a for-profit setting, that confidence can be quite good. It can get you through hard spots, and there's generally a much clearer feedback loop. You know, if you're not getting Series A funding or this sort of thing, it's more obvious that it's not a fit. In terms of comparing the two, kind of what might make you a better fit for one versus the other. I mean, if you're extremely interested in a specific area, that can be suggestive. So if you're extremely interested in animals, you know, there's kind of less for-profits that are in the animal space, maybe some alternate protein stuff, but not a lot. And of course, vice versa. You know, if you're extremely interested in applications, for example, a lot of people like the idea of having a charity application. There's not a huge kind of market for charity applications. It's quite hard to do that. But of course, in the for-profit space, there's lots of room for applications. So that might be a skill that will kind of like push you in the for-profit direction. I think it's good to apply for both. So, you know, if you apply for charity entrepreneurship and you get in, that's indicative. If you apply for Y Combinator and get in, or Entrepreneur First and get in, I think that's quite indicative as well. There's a lot of overlap in terms of skill sets, but that one can lean you one way or the other. Yeah, I think for-profit entrepreneurship, there's less scope for having a negative impact. So in that way, it's like a bit of a safer option. You know, if you don't get into, say, Y Combinator or charity entrepreneurship and you kind of want to do something impactful, it's probably easier to do something impactful via for-profit entrepreneurship than it is to start a nonprofit entrepreneurship that's really good. So, you know, that would be another aspect too.
Yeah, so you kind of touched on the negative impact at the end. And actually, so one of our questions was, do you think that for-profit entrepreneurship can at some point be harmful and that it can outweigh your donations?
Yeah, so this is a tricky question. There are some calculations that 80,000 Hours has done on this about kind of like what the harms are of different jobs. And there definitely are externalities of different jobs, both positive and negative. So we talked about social entrepreneurship and kind of positive externalities. There are, of course, negative externalities. If I create something that's maybe extremely tasty but extremely bad for the world, that could have negative externality flow through effects. I think when you're thinking about things in a for-profit context, and you're doing for-profits kind of with the goal of helping the world, you do want to think about what the kind of flow-through effect of that product will be and how significant it is. I'll say in most cases, the flow-through effects, unless you're explicitly kind of aiming for them, are going to be a lot smaller than the direct donations. So if you're imagining, you might think Google's good, Google's evil, but if they were donating 10% of their profits, that profit will probably be more significant than their impact one way or the other. That's the case for a lot of things. Maybe there are exceptions, like tobacco companies come to mind as maybe an example. But I think in many cases, your donations will be the primary impact, unless you're kind of explicitly thinking about a big flow-through effect that's going to come from that.
Great, thank you. We also got a couple of questions about the sort of social entrepreneurship models. So do you think, for example, that if a charity is struggling with fundraising from donors, it's possible to manage a sort of transition to a semi-for-profit model? And do you think that would have negative consequences for the charity?
It's tough to do. I mean, it depends a lot on the exact charity, but often charities are set up to fill a need that the market's not going to fill. So, animals don't have a lot of purchasing power. People in extreme poverty don't have a lot of purchasing power. This is often why a charity is created to do this. Often when a charity is created, it's because there's kind of not the market there that's going to be able to pay for the services or be interested in paying for the services. So it's tough. I mean, I have seen certain things where maybe if you demonstrate enough value and start that as a nonprofit, maybe there's some way to transition it. But I guess when I've consulted with projects on this, 9 times out of 10, it doesn't work out super well. It might make more sense just to kind of close up that department and think about, okay, well, from a clean slate, what might be the best for-profit idea that we could do, and then donate some percentage of the profits or something like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so do you think that it's harder to ensure ownership with a charity as sort of strictly non-profit venture rather than a sort of social or for-profit venture, given that the services provided are free?
Yeah, so this is part of why M&E is so important, because basically the people you're helping are very disconnected from the funders who are supporting your organization. And they might have completely different priorities. The people you're helping might want A, the funders might be most excited about B, and you kind of have to have both of those in mind as you're running your organization. So you don't have the very connected feedback loop where, presumably if someone's buying your product, that they are excited about your product, and both the consumer both funds and benefits from the product services. So I think that's complicated. And I think that can be, it can be more challenging, and it's definitely something you need to look out for as a nonprofit. But I think it can be dealt with, even with these separations. As I said, there are just market gaps that charities are going to have to fill, and going to kind of help these people who are very vulnerable. So challenge, yes. Inevitable, yes. That sort of thing can be tougher. You just have to make more of an effort to involve people. So, naturally, the market will speak if you're not appealing to people, where with charities, maybe you have to go out and do local surveys. Maybe you have to go out and get a little bit more hard data. This sort of thing is just kind of an extra step on the charitable side.
Yeah, thank you. So you've kind of touched on measurement and evaluation a bit here. One of our questions was, what are the growth metrics for tracking the development of an organization so one of the incubated charities that we've launched?
Yeah. This is a great question. So basically, I could talk about measurement and evaluation all day, so I'll try to keep it brief. But basically, if you have a theory of change, the necessary steps for an impact to happen, A happens, then B happens, and then C happens, then an impact happens. You want to get metrics as close to that impact happening as you can. So it often means quite far down the theory of change line. Unfortunately, these are going to be the most expensive and most difficult metrics to collect. So to use an example of Charity Science Health, the charity I founded before CE, we were doing text messages for vaccine reminders. Now, ultimately, what we cared about is saving lives because children got vaccines who wouldn't otherwise get vaccines. That's kind of where the good happens. That's very, very difficult to measure. And in fact, even the saving lives aspect, you have to vaccinate a really huge number of people before you start to see kind of lives saved compared to another population where only 50% of people are vaccinated. So that's very difficult data to get. So you got to go, okay, well, what can I measure sooner? You do want to measure that inline metric eventually, but you have to use a randomized control trial or some pretty heavy study methodology to do that. But when you take a step up, you want to think what correlates really well with this kind of inline metric that we're going for. So I can give a good example and a bad example. A bad example is we talked to an SMS reminder charity, and they measured how many people had signed up for the program. And this seems like a pretty obvious measure at first, like, okay, if you have a lot of people sign up for the program and a lot of people are getting text messages, surely that would lead to good. But of course, there's a lot more nuance there. So when we dug a little bit deeper, a lot of people had signed up, but the populations they were signing up were very, very high vaccination rate populations that already had 95% vaccination rate, 90% vaccination rate. So even though they were sending reminders to these populations, very few of them would have missed their vaccines anyways. A much better metric would have been population of unvaccinated people, or the number of unvaccinated children that you have in the population that you're sending out to. Something like that is closer to what you ultimately care about, which is people getting vaccines who otherwise wouldn't have. So with M&E, you want to go as close to the bottom of the chain as you can and have as tight a correlation between each step as you can. The thing you really got to be careful as a nonprofit is the easiest, shiniest metrics will be much less meaningful. So, if you're looking at something like website traffic, if you're trying to save people with vaccinations, website traffic is a pretty poor way of measuring that. There's 100 ways to boost my website traffic that have no effect whatsoever on people eventually getting their lives saved by vaccines. So we read a little bit about this, and I think this is one of the things people learn about M&E is kind of how to measure the right metrics instead of kind of vanity metrics that maybe look really good on a website, or maybe a donor is encouraging you to measure, but maybe does not relate to the actual people being helped.
Great, yeah, so we got a good follow-up question to this point about measurement and evaluation. So how do you know when to shut down a project? So what are the signs that you look for? And at what point do you say that you've sort of given enough time for impact and it's ready to close down?
This is a question I ask in interviews pretty often, actually. So I wonder if this person's thinking about what my answer would be to the question. So again, looking at the proxies, different charities have different causal chains, different theories of steps. There's some things that make it quite obvious to shut down charitable organizations. So maybe you do a randomized control trial, or another randomized control trial is done on a very similar area, shows that your charity isn't having the impact that you perceived it to have, or the impact to make it competitive with other charities that are kind of in the same field. That would be a case for a shutdown. But at an earlier stage, you are looking more at these kind of proxy metrics. So are you getting traction? So if we're looking at, say, Charity Science Health, obviously at the end of the day, RCT on vaccination rate, that's what really matters. But let's say we text message out 100,000 people, and we call a sample of those 100,000 people, 1,000 of them. We check, hey, did you receive a text message? If so, what was it about? Do you remember what it was about? Did you get a vaccination from that or not? That's, again, not a perfect proxy because there's a lot of different factors that go into influencing them. If they know you're calling from the organization, they're going to be inclined to be quite positive to you. But it's kind of one step up the causal chain that you can measure a little bit easier before running a full RCT. And if you're seeing bad signs as you move up the causal chain, that generally means it will get even worse as you go down the causal chain. If you're calling up lots of people and none of them recall that they've ever received a text message about vaccinations, that isn't going to look good when it's fully tested on a RCT scale. So kind of looking up that chain. Why most people stop their NGOs is because they can't get funding. But I actually think that is only slightly correlated to an NGO running well or not. Often that's more to do with how shiny the website is, or how wealthy the cause area is that's investing in it. I'm much more concerned about these intermediate metrics not looking good, progress not being made. Maybe we can take a harder example, something like an alcohol tax campaign. Okay, well, what are the proxies for this sort of thing? Well, maybe you have to know that X policy needs to be passed. For X policy to be passed, this many ministers have to be positive or be in favor of this policy. How many conversations have you had with ministers? How positive have each of those conversations been? What's the sort of policy they're already considering? What's the sort of policy that you're pitching, and how big a difference would that make? These sort of proxies. If you're not getting good traction on that, that could be suggestive. Doesn't mean you shut down your charity right away as soon as you bump into a struggle. You want to try kind of different methodologies, but if you're not moving down closer and closer to that kind of end line of your causal chain and getting more and more evidence about each step, then it does mean that probably you're not making the impact you want to have. Setting up SMART goals ahead of time, making sure that you're kind of staying adhered to those SMART goals, having a really smart advisory board that can look over it with a skeptical eye and say, hey, relative to other charities, you seem to be progressing quite well here, you seem to be struggling here. All these sorts of things are nice proxies too. A funder can be a proxy if you really, really trust the funder. So for instance, I like GiveWell. I think they're a very good funder. If they fund something, I see that as quite a positive sign. If they don't, I see that as quite a negative sign. That seems fair, but keep in mind that not all funders are trying to maximize impact, maybe the same way you would be. So advisors who might include funders might include just people who you think are kind of smart and critical, might be the first kind of sign.
Yeah, I think we'll just have time for one more question. So I'll pick a sort of broader one. So do you have any advice on how a person can sort of get impact-focused career guidance in general?
Yeah, so there are a couple organizations that focus on this in different areas. So Animal Advocacy Careers is a really great organization. They are kind of very explicitly focused on how to have the most impact if you think animals are kind of the top place to work. Definitely recommend checking them out. They went through our program. That's how they got founded. 80,000 Hours does a pretty similar thing with AI as its primary focus. And then there's another organization that's launching pretty soon called Probably Good, which I'm also very excited about. And they'll be focusing on some other areas, including kind of global poverty, mental health, this sort of thing. So yeah, that sort of thing is great. I mean, going to places like the Effective Altruism Conference, the Effective Altruism Forum, and seeing those sort of threads, sometimes there's a thread about what operations work is like, or what working at a certain organization is like. Those are all useful things too. But maybe my top career advice when kind of very early stage and trying to figure things out is as many things as you can try out, the better. So if you can get short volunteering stints, short interning stints, lots of testing, that's going to give you a good sense, maybe even more of a sense than a one-on-one career advice coaching session would.
Great, thank you so much. So I think we're pretty much at the dot of 6 o'clock. So I will allow people to get on with the rest of their day. But thank you so much, Joey, for your talk and for answering all these questions. And thanks to everyone who attended. Hope to see you all at some of our future events. And yeah, I think Ula has been sharing some useful links in the chat, so you can scroll through and find some great stuff about mentorship opportunities and resources, etc.
Exactly. And if you do have more questions that we didn't get around to, definitely feel free to send them via our contact form and this sort of thing as well. If we get a question a couple times, we try to throw an event related to it or put it into our FAQ and kind of write up a detailed answer to it. So even if we don't answer it on the spot, it can kind of queue up as a thing that a lot of people are interested in.